Hello everyone and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to be showing you how to embed FFX file presets inside of your After Effects script. This is going to be super useful if you want to protect your FFX files and presets that you created. Normally when you release a product to the public, you might have your FFX files physically next to your script, extension, or other tools, and any user that can find these FFX files, which are pretty easily accessible, could simply take that and use it however they want. So to protect it, what we can do is sort of grab the code within it and store it inside of our script. But we'll also need a custom way to apply it afterwards. So today we're going to be taking an input FFX file, converting it into some data, base64 data to be exact, writing it to a temporary FFX file, applying that FFX file to a layer, and then removing the FFX file, effectively just embedding it and protecting it inside of our script. And yes, I know what you're probably thinking. If you're a normal viewer of this channel, it's been a long time, I think like 4 months since my last video. I've said multiple times I was taking a break, and I took an even longer break, and I think I'm finally ready to get back into it. I really just got burnt out from making so many videos and not feeling like I had a lot of creative ideas. So I'm going to be coming out with lots of creative ideas, useful ideas, and stuff like that. So this script is essentially, when we run it, it just looks like I've applied an FFX preset, which has modified my footage. But in reality, what it's doing is writing the data to a file, and then reading that data back into a temporary FFX file. So it's kind of different modules that we're going to be working with today. We're going to create a new script, and I'm going to copy and paste two important functions that I'm not going to code from scratch, just because they're complicated and not necessarily needed to code from scratch. This is a base64 decode and a base64 encode function. Essentially what this will do is take an input string, convert it to base64, or vice versa. So if we wanted to test this real quick, let's throw in a write line. I'll zoom in here just a little bit for you. We will do a write line of, what do we want to encode? Base64 encode. Let's encode some sample text like this. And you can see the result is this base64 string. If I was to maybe say decode, it's probably not going to do much. In fact, it doesn't give us anything, which is understandable because it's not really a base64 code. So let's say we create a variable called encode, and this is going to be equal to our base64 encode, and we'll encode the text. So if we write this, you can see, once again, we get this interesting encoded base64 string. Now, if we wanted to just know what the original string is, we'll get base64 decode, and we'll decode our encode. I know it's kind of loop sounding, but as you can see, we get our original text back. So what we're going to basically do is use these two functions to grab the code from an FFX file. We're going to base64 encode it, which is going to give us a big, complicated base64 string like this. And then when we're ready, we're going to decode it to apply it. So the encode is really to store it, and that's how we can protect it in our script. And then the decode is when we want to apply said FFX preset instead of using an actual FFX file. And as you'll see, we're actually going to use, yes, an FFX file, but we're going to delete it so that essentially the user can't grab that and have access to the original FFX. So with that said, instead of a string, what we're going to be using is an FFX file. I'm going to create a variable called FFX File. I'll go ahead and collapse these. And we're going to set this equal to a file. I have an existing FFX file on my desktop called ffx1.ffx. Really original. And just to make sure it exists, I'm too lazy to check my desktop. You can see it does not exist. There might be a space. It's just fx1, not ffx1. So that exists, true, perfect. Now what we want to do is read this file. Again, we're going to grab all the data inside of the FFX file, and instead of having that for the user to be able to access, we're going to make a string that represents the entire file, and we're going to store that in our script. So we're going to say var. So we need to grab our FFX file, and we're going to set the encoding to binary. Why do we set it to binary? Because the sort of data we want to get out of it is binary. And then we're going to say ffx file dot open, and we're going to open it so that we can read it. So we're going to say R is the argument. Then I'm just going to have a thing called binary data. You can say binary string, whatever. And this is going to be equal to our FFX file dot read. That means we're going to take our FFX file and read the contents of it and store it in this variable. Pretty self-explanatory. So anytime we open a file in JavaScript scripting like this, we need to close it. So we'll close the file. Now let's go ahead and see if binary data will tell us anything if we write it in our console here. Nope. It could be that it's too big to read, so let's go ahead and try a slice. We'll slice between 0 and 30 as the position, and still nothing. Maybe if we choose string. So as you can see, it almost feels like we have no access to it, but that's because it's in binary format. Let's go ahead and turn it into a format which we can display and maybe see what it looks like. And this is where our original encode comes from. So we can say base64 encode. What do we want to encode? Binary data. And we can just say base64 FFX data is equal to that. Now let's go ahead and write the line of this encoded binary data. As you can see, it quickly flashed on the screen, which means we are actually getting something, but because it's so big, it's not going to display in our console. So this is where we could then maybe slice or substring something out of it. As you can see, we have a whole bunch of information there. Maybe we could do 500. So here we have the base64 encoded string, which is the data from our FFX file. This means that we could literally just store this raw string inside of our script, like have a variable like var FFX data is equal to this. And obviously you need to make it proper like that or something, and boom. This is something that you could store inside of your file and protect it from prying eyes. But obviously this is only a slice of our entire data. So what I'm going to do is make sure that we can actually access the entire FFX string data. So we're going to write it out to a file. We'll say var output file. This will be a file we create on our desktop. Let's just call it data output.txt. We're going to open up our file for writing. So W is the argument for the open. And we're going to say, what are we going to write? We're going to write our base64 FFX data. This will basically allow us that we can actually see what's going on. We'll close it. This. Now if I run it, see, it looks like nothing happened. But if I load up the file on my desktop, you can see we have our entire string here. There's lots of repeating stuff, which is totally fine. This whole thing right here represents our FFX file. So like I said before, we can store that in a variable as a string. And boom, just like that. Now go ahead and delete your FFX file. You don't need it anymore. It's inside of our script. And that's also, of course, a joke. You might want to keep it for other reasons, in case if you need to change it or anything like that. I'm actually going to turn word wrap off for once. Okay, so now we have it basically saved. You can create your own function out of this and just call it save FFX data, and you're going to get the entire file read into this variable here. But now maybe we want to take this and apply it. So looking back here, I'm going to remove the FFX I applied earlier. We're just going to, for reference, use this single layer inside of this composition as our layer reference. So I'm going to say layer is equal to app.project.activeItem. We're assuming the active item is the composition, layer number 1. Because in order to apply an FFX, we need to have a layer object to say apply preset. Now apply preset requires an argument which is a file object of an FFX file. And in this case, we have a string. So there's a few steps we need to take in order to get this FFX data converted so that we can use it in the right context. So the first thing we're going to do is the opposite of encoding here. We have our base64 FFX data. And I'm going to call this one decode. And instead of base64 encode, I'm going to use base64 decode. The options you have here are to, the binary data here is old, right? So you have the option to avoid writing this to a file whatsoever, you can just store the base 64 FFX data straight up, or you can read the data from this file. So I'm just going to take this one that I pasted here, the FFX data, and let's go ahead and write this and see if we get anything. See nothing. It's decoded. So again, when we tried earlier to see this binary data that we read, we can't see it. So you may not be able to see it there, but we can get the length, for example, to make sure it's valid. You can see it's got 14,000 characters in it. So that's a sign that it's working okay. You're just not going to be able to print out the whole thing, obviously. So we have the decoded data. Why is that important? Because the FFX file needs to be in the binary format. So we converted it to base 64 in order to make it readable and easy to stick in a file or stick in a variable. If it was in binary, it's going to be super hard to put into a variable. So we want to make sure it's in a format easy to store. And then we take that easy to store format back into binary to make sure that we can apply it properly. Now that we have the decoded binary data, what we're going to do is create a temporary FFX file. I know this whole concept seems like it's to avoid using FFX files whatsoever, but we will have to do a sort of temporary FFX file and then delete it in order to make it work. Unfortunately, there is only one way to apply these FFX files, and that requires an actual FFX file. So what we're going to do is create temp FFX file. And let's go ahead and just save this on our desktop. It's a good location for temporary stuff. We'll call it temp.ffx.ffx. Right? This file doesn't exist yet, but we're about to create it. So we'll say temp ffxfile.open. We're opening to write some data to it. Once again, like up here, the encoding needs to be binary. Why does it need to be binary? Because FFX files require it. It needs to be in binary format for it to work properly. So we set the encoding to binary rather than say UTF-8 or something like that. We're going to open it so that we can write to it with the W. And then what are we going to write to it? We're going to say .write. We're going to write our base 64 FFX decode. And then once again, we must close any file that we open. And now, to apply an FFX, if you don't know already, you simply take a layer and you say apply preset. And that preset needs to be a file object, not a string, not a path to a file object with like this. So we have one already, which we just wrote in binary format, the decode data. So we're going to apply that temp FFX file we just created as a preset. If I go ahead and run this code, in fact, I don't even need this first part because we have the FFX data embedded here. So we're just doing the application process. Hit play. You can see we already apply our FFX. However, looking at our desktop, you can see we have the temp FFX file there, which is a problem. We don't want them to have access to it. So what we're going to do is say temp FFX file.remove. So what that'll do is it'll apply the FFX data from the file and then delete it from the desktop so it's no longer there. Now, that's basically the whole workflow. You read a file, you convert it to a string-like data format so that we can store it in another file or in the script itself as a variable. And then we convert that string sort of data back into binary data, which is required for the FFX to run properly. And then we write it to a temporary file, apply that temporary file, and then remove that file. And it is strange that after you apply this FFX and delete it, the values are still going to work. It doesn't require the file to be active. You might get a pop-up in certain versions of After Effects saying, oh, this FFX file is missing. For that, you could put in a suppress dialogues, perhaps, to stop that from popping up. But this is the best practice as of now to embed, read, and store your FFX files and then reapply them inside of After Effects scripts. I don't know if I mentioned it at the beginning, but I did have a previous tutorial called How to Embed FFX Files in a Script. I followed that same tutorial in the process of creating this tool, and it's only for pseudo effects. That whole thing was really just for pseudo effects, which are sort of custom-made XML effect appearing things. This is for any FFX. You can take any FFX file and preserve it in this manner. So this is an even better method than the previous tutorial, and hopefully that's not confusing. But thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. There's plenty more on the way. If you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button down below, hit subscribe, and check out the links in the description to support and join the Discord. We'll see you next time.